Hi everyone, I hope you're all well and welcome to episode 100 of the James Layton Fitness Podcast. So first I just want to say thank you very much for those who have listened to the podcast from the beginning or perhaps you've only recently started listening to the podcast, but I'm really pleased that we have got to the 100 podcast episode mark because it really does take a lot of time and effort to create the podcast. It's always great to hear people's comments regarding the podcast. So thank you very much if you've been one of those individuals that's listened to a long time and hopefully more importantly you've actually taken action, implemented what I've discussed in this podcast and got some results. So as of today, as of recording this podcast, we have 53,852 downloads, which is incredible. So I'm really humbled that I've had that many downloads for the podcast. I think this podcast has been up now for a couple of years approximately. So once again, thank you very much for listening and for the support. So in this specific episode, we'll be discussing this concept of, well, if it works for me, it will work for you. And by that I mean this was a very popular concept probably about 3 or 4 years ago, where instead of people having more of an evidence-based approach to the nutrition and training advice they were giving out, they would literally just provide information based upon what worked for them. And the reality, if you end up following some of these people, you can be in a position where you're implementing things that really aren't necessary. And I'll give you a couple of good examples within this podcast. You'll be implementing things that aren't applicable to you, and therefore you'll create more stress, you'll do more work to get the exact same result. However, for the most part, I think now the industry is certainly moving in the right direction. There's certainly a lot more evidence-based practitioners out there. There's certainly more of a science-based movement to use the weight of available evidence to then guide practice, which I think has really helped dramatically, because hopefully some of the things you've learned in my podcast and what I've learned and applied to myself are things that, as I mentioned, almost things that make achieving fat loss and muscle growth so much simpler. We're actually taking away rather than adding. And I'll discuss a couple of examples, one of which is meal frequency and nutrient time. These things that people think are very important to them but are actually only important to a certain context, and by not concerning yourself too much of this will just make it so much easier to achieve your fat loss or muscle building goals. So here's a couple of examples where this was very typical in the past. So like I said, 3 or 4 years ago, it was very popular for people to preach this concept of a higher meal frequency will yield better results for fat loss. It means a higher metabolic rate, but the reality is the evidence just doesn't stack up. This is one of the good things about the information, for the most part, that's been provided now, is we now know that within a fat loss phase, meal frequency does not have an impact on your metabolic rate. And therefore, someone that has 8 meals per day versus 3 meals per day, as long as calories and macronutrients are matched, and then the result will be exactly the same for that individual. So this is a great example of people previously preaching something that would have been more stressful, the 8 meals, versus now you can just have as many meals as you choose as long as you're meeting your daily calorie and macronutrient targets. That's the most important thing, and that really is a game changer. I know from my personal experience, when I used to be one of those individuals that would eat 6-7 meals per day, probably 3 or 4 years ago, you didn't really have a life because you're almost just boxed into eating at a certain point, eating every 2 to 3 hours. It's not really particularly sustainable. Whereas now I have a much more flexible approach, still meeting those daily totals, but really letting my personal preference dictate meal frequency. And as such, I usually have 3 to 4 meals per day. Now, it's also important to note within a muscle building phase, meal frequency is slightly more important because we need to maximize muscle protein synthesis. So I wouldn't recommend going any lower than 3 meals per day within that context, but within a fat loss phase, let your personal preference dictate the amount of meals you have and how frequently you eat. But the good news is 3 meals per day should be relatively attainable for most individuals within a muscle building phase. Now, the second example I wanted to provide you was how soon you should have your post-workout meal. Again, this was something 3 or 4 years ago people would say you need to eat immediately after training. You need to have protein, carbs within half an hour of your workout, otherwise you're going to lose all your gains and all this nonsense. However, it's really critical that we break this down and actually consider context. Remember, context is so critical because it allows us to differentiate what's important for one individual versus another. So this is a great example within the context of someone that trains twice per day and endurance training. Things like nutrient timing between session 1 and session 2 is very important for this individual, because speed of glycogen synthesis is very important, because they're doing 2 endurance type training sessions per day. However, this is not most people. Most people are going to the gym once per day and they have goals of fat loss and muscle growth, and as such, within this context, in terms of glycogen, this will take care of itself for the 24-hour mark, with the caveat you consume sufficient carbohydrates within that day. So that just puts into context the need to replenish glycogen for most of you listening to this podcast. Second thing, we need to consider protein. So protein is important to halt protein breakdown and to kickstart muscle protein synthesis. However, if you were to have a pre-exercise meal, approximately within a couple of hours prior to the training bout, containing at least protein, will have amino acids being absorbed during the session and for several hours post-workout as well. Again, that puts the need for that post-workout meal into context if you have a pre-exercise meal within a couple of hours prior to the training bout. Next thing is insulin. You'll hear there's again something very common that people used to say 3 or 4 years ago: you need to spike insulin post-workout. But first, it's important to know that protein and carbohydrates are insulinogenic. It's not just carbohydrates. People think it's just carbohydrates that cause an insulin response. It's not. Protein is also insulinogenic as well, and therefore by having at least protein or carbohydrates pre-workout, or both, you'll have insulin will be above fasting levels during the session and for several hours post-workout as well. Again, putting the need for this post-workout meal into context. Now, with that being said, I would still recommend eating relatively close to the training bout within a few hours, but you don't need to be eating immediately after the session or even within 30 minutes like you have been taught previously. Remember, within the context, I'm talking about people that have muscle growth goals or fat loss goals who are just training once per day. If you're an endurance athlete, nutrient timing and what you have post-workout between session 1 and session 2 is a lot more important. So hopefully that's helped. Hopefully this concept of if it works for me, it works for you. You should try and avoid people that are preaching that type of mantra and look more at evidence-based practitioners that are using the weight of available evidence to dictate their practice. Hopefully that's been useful. Thank you very much for listening. If you're still yet to subscribe to the podcast, please do. And also, if you're still yet to download my free ebook, How to Set Up a Nutrition Plan, if you go to James Layton, Layton fitness.co.uk, you'll see a tab at the top of the page and you can download that immediately. Thank you very much. I look forward to speaking to you next week.